Vince McMahon's reign atop the wrestling world is officially over. After 4 decades running the show, the 76-year-old tycoon recently announced his retirement from World Wrestling Entertainment, the promotion company he bought in 1982 and ultimately transformed into a multi-billion-dollar corporation and cultural behemoth. McMahon's retirement comes amid allegations of misconduct against the longtime chairman and CEO. Specifically, that McMahon paid over $12 million in hush money to 4 different women to cover up allegations of sexual misconduct and infidelity over a period of 16 years. Still, while his career ends in disgrace, and without trivializing those allegations, few sports figures in the last half-century have had a greater impact than McMahon, who propelled wrestling into the mainstream, revolutionized sports entertainment, and became a billionaire in the process. Let's dive into that complicated legacy a bit, shall we? Sit back, relax, and take this in. McMahon was born with wrestling in his blood. His grandfather, a first-generation Irish immigrant, was a boxing and wrestling promoter in New York City, as was his father, who helped found the Capitol Wrestling Corporation in the early 1950s and eventually became the foremost wrestling promoter in the northeastern United States. As it happens, McMahon, whose parents got divorced when he was quite young, didn't actually meet his father until he was 12, but as soon as the two were introduced and McMahon got his first exposure to the world of professional wrestling, he knew he wanted to follow in his father's and grandfather's footsteps. So, not long after graduating from East Carolina University in the late 1960s, McMahon started working for his father's company, first as an in-ring announcer and eventually as a promoter. And in those nascent years with the promotion, McMahon saw an infinite amount of untapped potential. At the time, pro wrestling was a regional product. As McMahon put it in a 1991 interview with Sports Illustrated, there were wrestling fiefdoms all over the country, each with its own little lord in charge. Each little lord respected the rights of his neighboring little lord. No raids or takeovers were allowed. McMahon, however, didn't want to play by those rules. Instead, after buying his dad's company from him in 1982 and taking over what was then known as the World Wrestling Federation, McMahon became a full-on disruptor, laying waste to the industry's traditional practices and models and consolidating his own power in the process. McMahon's WWF started touring nationally and brazenly encroached on the territories of other promoters, either by scheduling fights opposite theirs or by signing exclusive agreements with venues. He started poaching other promotion stars, none bigger than his pull of Hulk Hogan from the American Wrestling Association. And he effectively leveraged the immense power of cable TV, aggressively marketing the WWF, buying out other promotions' airtime, and syndicating his own programming. Meanwhile, McMahon also had the inspired idea to turn what had been a niche sport into a full-on show, upping production values, embracing theatricality, and ultimately transforming WWF matches into must-watch television. Entrance music, celebrity appearances, soap opera storylines, that was all McMahon, who never shied away from acknowledging the staged, scripted, worked nature of the WWF. He called it sports entertainment, not sports, for a reason. And thanks to his vision, pro wrestling had become mainstream entertainment by the mid-1980s. And McMahon's lordship over the industry was cemented in 1985 with WrestleMania No. 1, a sold-out supercard pay-per-view extravaganza that eventually became the promotion's flagship event. Before long, the WWF had exploded into a globally recognized brand and money-making machine, with McMahon churning countless licensing deals out of his promotion and its stars. By the late 90s, in fact, McMahon was actually part of the show, portraying a fictionalized version of himself in the ring and eventually becoming a 2-time world champion with a Royal Rumble victory to his name as well. And though many rival promotions tried to compete with the WWF over the years, notably Ted Turner's WCW around the turn of the century, McMahon eventually either put them out of business or bought them out, further cementing his monopoly over pro wrestling. And while wrestling's popularity has dwindled some over the last couple decades, the now called WWE remains as successful as ever. In 2021, the company generated more than $1 billion in revenue, establishing a new record. Meanwhile, as the publicly traded company's majority shareholder, McMahon's personal net worth as of July 2022 stands at $2.5 billion, according to Forbes. Still, as rich as he is and as integral as he was in making pro wrestling and combat sports more broadly as popular as they are today, McMahon's legacy remains littered with indiscretions and allegations of misconduct. During a 1992 appearance on Geraldo Rivera's talk show, Rita Chatterton, the first woman referee in WWE history, accused McMahon of raping her in a limousine in 1986. McMahon denied the claims, then sued both Chatterton and Rivera. In 1994, McMahon went on trial for allegedly distributing illegal anabolic steroids to his wrestlers. He was ultimately acquitted, but the trial nevertheless cast a pall over the WWF and McMahon's integrity. Years later, another woman accused McMahon of sexually assaulting her at a Florida tanning booth in 2006. Prosecutors eventually dropped the case, even though police documents said there was probable cause to believe the victim. And finally, the Wall Street Journal dropped a bombshell report just last month that revealed that McMahon was being investigated by his own company for allegedly dishing out millions of dollars in hush money to keep more allegations of sexual misconduct under wraps. 2 days after the story went public, McMahon stepped down as CEO and chairman of the WWE and handed the reins to his daughter Stephanie, pending the results of the investigation. 5 weeks later, however, before the investigation concluded, McMahon officially retired. And ultimately, if this is indeed the last we hear from McMahon, the final chapter of his public life is a disgraceful one, and far from the first, for the most important figure in the history of pro wrestling.